Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar about the ransomware threat and how NHS bodies are tackling this successfully. I'm James Nadal. I'm a technology writer with Osirium and a former health journalist. This is my colleague Graham.
Good afternoon, my name is Graham Hawkey. I'm a PAM specialist in the NHS sector for Osirium.
And before we start, we've got a poll. We'd just like to ask you a question to help our discussion today. So we're going to put that on the screen now for you. Thank you very much for your responses on that. So we can see that 75% of people joining today haven't got that PAM solution in place and 25 have. Thank you for your answers on that. So let's get started. So just to start off with, let's take a look at how the NHS is approaching the threat. So the beginnings of a new cyber strategy, NHS cyber strategy, were announced recently, and this emphasised the importance it has for patient safety. We're expecting more news on the strategy in the summer, and Osirium is going to be sharing summaries and articles in due course, so watch out for those. The NHS strategy talks about protecting devices, services and networks and the information they contain. To name a few examples, we're talking about things like devices, some of the devices, we're talking about diagnostic machines, imaging scanners, systems that let hospitals know which beds are free, also patient booking systems, electronic prescription services, amongst others. So moving on to look at how vulnerable is the NHS? Well, we've seen numerous examples in the UK and also around the world of cyber attacks which have badly disrupted the running of services with significant consequences. The most famous example being WannaCry in 2017, which devastated NHS systems and crippled business operations. There were 80 at least trusts affected out of 236 according to NHS England. Last year, we saw a ransomware attack on a software supplier which provides software for various parts of the NHS. That caused widespread outages. It affected services such as patient referrals, ambulance dispatch, out-of-hours appointment bookings, mental health services and emergency prescriptions. And one further example, in Ireland, 2021, there was a major ransomware attack on the health service executive, and we know that caused 80% of the IT environment to become encrypted. Indeed, the policy paper for the cyber strategy talks about this ransomware being the most significant cyber threat the sector faces. So, moving on to look at the NHS view on privileged access. What is that? So, it's clear from looking at the beginnings of this new cyber strategy that privileged access is a key point. The dangers of misusing privileged access are highlighted as a critical concern there. Already, managing privileged access features prominently in the NHS's DSP cybersecurity guidelines. Just a few examples. The requirements ask IT leaders to closely manage privileged user access to networks and information systems. The toolkit also prompts staff to consider third parties and how they're being granted privileged access, something we will come back to and grow a bit later. The cyber strategy also highlights the potential insider threat posed by staff or contractors. So let's have a look at how Osirium is helping the NHS. So you would have already seen when you signed up for this webinar that we work with more than 50 NHS organisations. They trust us to manage their privileged access. So Graham, handing over to you, can you tell us a bit more about why so many NHS trusts have chosen Osirium to manage their privileged access, please?
Thank you, James. Yeah, brilliant subject matter. Yeah, so a lot of NHS trusts, actually over 50, have chosen Osirium for various different reasons, but they kind of fall into that privileged access management part. Most NHS trusts have shortage of staff, don't have the ability to control everything going on with lots of third parties and suppliers having access to the infrastructure and the trusts. So we see that going on a quite a large scale. There's a lot of outsourcing going on. Lots of people need access to different types of equipment in the hospital, not just the IT equipment. And as we've seen a number of times recently, supply chain access is a function that's used to execute ransomware, not just on NHS but other organisations as well. So they always have a concern around those type of threats. Lots of NHS trusts, well, all of them need to adhere to DSP to make sure they're compliant with the security parameters, so we can help with that as well. And obviously with privileged access management, it's about securing access for things like your supply chain, your third-party access to your environment, so we can help with that as well.
And Graham, when you first have that initial conversation with an NHS trust and they come and talk about some of their sort of major challenges they're facing, what would you say the sort of 2 or 3 of those would be normally?
Well, the main one that we come across, there's a few, but the main sort of thing that we generally see is supply chain access. It's very common for an attack chain. People are starting to work out that attacking one point, which looks after multiples, can really sort of damage and get information and things that they want to, and cause the havoc that they like to, obviously. Things that we've done initiatives with, backup protection was a big thing that we did a few years ago. So over 50 NHS trusts, majority of those would be using us for backup protection. Multi-factor authentication being built into our platform, very important for organisations to be able to use that. And with Osirium, we can shift left. So we're giving privilege more to help desk and service desk, and freeing up more time for more senior members of staff in the IT teams to carry on with more project-based work.
I think it's worth pointing out here that on our website you'll see some examples of some of the NHS organisations who have trusted us to manage their privileged access. So the Midlands and Lancashire Commissioning Support Unit, who provide a broad range of services to about 200 organisations, they came to us particularly with a concern about the DSP cybersecurity requirements and compliance with that. Graham, could you tell us a bit more about DSP and perhaps that example?
Yes, obviously DSP is the compliance driver that the NHS trusts are working towards. There's some changes coming with the CAF and stuff going on at the moment, but generally it's a nice, good framework methodology for organisations to adhere to, which gives them nice parameter control over their access points. And we're talking about privileged access here to critical core infrastructure, things like backup systems, things like servers, switches, firewalls, routers, patient information, records and data. So having the ability to control access from administrations to those type of systems, control that access, the passwords and the keys that are used to connect those users, and the ability to audit and record what's going on in those environments for analysis purposes and control purposes. Very important.
And there's another example, NHS Lanarkshire, which is the 3rd largest NHS authority in Scotland. They care for nearly 700,000 people. I know that when they came to Osirium, they were having some struggles with lack of visibility and control of supplier access, something you mentioned, Graham, and concerns over privileged access for internal staff and third-party suppliers. So these case studies are available on our website for anyone who'd like to look into more and discover more about why they're working with Osirium. So looking now a bit more into challenges, we're just going to ask you another question. We're going to put a poll up here for you to look at, and we'd love to get your thoughts on which of these is your biggest challenge. We'll just give you a little while to send us your answers on that, please, if you don't mind.
I see the results coming in live. Excellent.
Thank you very much for that. It's interesting. There's quite a mixture of responses there. We've some people saying DSP, some people ransomware, third party, backups, yeah, and other things too. So yeah, thank you for those responses. Interesting results there. Now we're going to look a bit more at the threats of ransomware and how we go about reducing that. So Graham, I know that local admin rights are a prime target for cyber attacks, aren't they? Can you explain a little bit more about that, please, and also why protecting the endpoints is so important here?
Yeah, great point, James. And there's a couple of things to mention about here. Local admin rights, we'll start with the endpoints. Removing local administration rights to the endpoint is a very good thing to do. Obviously, we can do that with our EPM product. That allows you to simply deploy it so that users can interact with the applications and services that are required for their job function, while still retaining the context of a standard user and elevating the application as admin. It's very important, keeping the standard user context across the environment so there's no chance of any lateral movement. Stopping people getting in the front door, clicking on links and things that are sent out for various different ways of approaching and performing a potential ransomware attack. And then second to that, we have the infrastructure on the back end. So the core critical infrastructure that a trust or a hospital is running itself upon. That has local accounts as well, slightly differently to the local accounts that are running on the endpoints. But again, controlling access to those, limiting access to those type of accounts that are needed and required for administration access into the target estate, but controlling those and auditing them and having the ability to rotate those passwords, multi-factor authentication into the environment, and then having the ability to know who has access to those accounts as well, and other security tooling as well that you can use outside of Osirium PAM.
I know when we're talking about that, we said about endpoint privilege management, aren't we? Osirium has a solution for that, Osirium EPM. So also, Graham, could I just also ask you a little bit about PAM specifically? You've touched upon it there, but perhaps a little bit more detail on PAM. How does that help with ransomware protection? Possibly a quick kind of look at features such as screen recording, how that's relevant.
Screen recording is something that can capture something that's happened, but most importantly, it's not just PAM, but Osirium PAM, really. We kind of differentiate ourselves in the market. We are not just a vault, so we're not checking in and out credentials to the users. We're injecting, as a single sign-on type approach, the credential or password into the system and then changing that in line with policy. So that if you think about ransomware attack, we talk about backups earlier, and we talk about them again in this scenario, is take a critical core system that people access need to for their job function. Well, someone else might want to access that for a bad reason, and that's what we're kind of thinking of protecting. Putting the Osirium PAM in the middle and using that to authenticate and inject the credentials to the system, limiting the amount of people that have access. Just-in-time approval type features would come into play here. So we can only allow people on certain systems at a certain time when that's been designated and approved by someone. And that's a very important thing that can help protect against that as well.
Great, thanks, Graham. So looking at another aspect now, again, we've touched upon this a little bit already, but let's drill down a bit further into the dangers from third-party access. So, Graham, could you talk a little bit, please, about, from your point of view, what would you say the dangers of third-party access and the challenges around that? So we know that third parties are obviously very important for many organisations.
Yeah, the supply chain to not just hospitals and trusts, but importantly to hospitals and trusts is extremely important. It happens all of the time. It's dangerous. There are some dangers that play out in this particular scenario, but it's a necessity for modern life. Third-party contractors, anyone in supply chain that has access to the hospital for various reasons needs to. So that has to happen. So it's about limiting the risk and controlling the risk, controlling the amount of accounts that can access, making sure those credentials are stored within your network, within your hospital, not leaked out to the third party that can write them down on a post-it note or a screen and then have lots of people using that to access your environment. Having multi-factor authentication built in, again, a good tool built into our product, included in the subscription. That allows you to re-authenticate people to make sure they say who they are, making sure the accounts that they're using are clean and tidy and hygiene across the estate. And also with Osirium, you can start to shift left, as I mentioned earlier, and start to have help desk and service desk semi and automatically connecting to machines rather than through our privileged access management platform, which we can discuss later as well.
Talking again about the cyber strategy, what NHS has talked about so far, I mean, they talk about third-party supplier can cause just an attack on the third-party supplier can cause just as much or more damage as a direct attack. That's right, isn't it? Yeah,
it's a very clear point. I mean, if I was thinking about attacking something, it would obviously be something that gives me entry points to multiple organisations. So a third party, similar to we've seen in the attack recently with the tooling that was used. If you think about a tool that's used across multiple organisations, you get entry points to that tool, you get entry points to multiple organisations. So it's about controlling the supply chain. It's growing. The supply chain is growing as we move forward. Everything's becoming more MSP and third-party supplier access to organisations. And the supply chain could involve any different types of organisations accessing your data or your infrastructure for various reasons. So it's really around controlling, protecting, and having strong, tight parameters around that. And things like DSP, that's a good place to start. It gives you that compliance that brings you up to the audit level, which is going to give you the controls to be able to put those parameters in place.
So I think the example you're alluding to, Graham, there was we saw as a big news story, which you may have seen this year. The BBC, British Airways, Boots, all suffered from a ransomware attack, and that arose through a third party. It was a piece of software called Movers, so it's clearly a big issue. Graham, is there any more you'd like to say about how Osirium helps protect the NHS from the dangers of third party? You've touched on quite a few points there, but
yes, it's one of our main use cases for the NHS. Lots of suppliers to a hospital, sometimes hundreds or thousands of suppliers to an individual hospital or trust, or as we're seeing now, as it's cascading together into the CSUs. So it's all coming together and it's all working in the right direction. But that's one of the #1 things I would look at is who has access to things, why do they have access to things, and do they need access to any of those things?
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So another aspect that's important to look at here is the threat to backup systems. So we know that backup systems and backups themselves are being targeted by ransomware attackers. The National Cyber Security Centre said that NHS trusts should pay extra attention to protecting backup systems. So clearly very important. So Graham, can you tell us a bit more, please, about how does PAM help when it comes to protecting backups?
Yeah, backup system is the point of recovery from any organisation. If you have no access to your backup system, you can't recall back to the original layer where you need to. So having an attack and taking out infrastructure is one thing, but taking out the backup can be catastrophic to an organisation. If you've got everything backed up in that system, you can't get access to it because it's now been encrypted and there's a ransom on it. There's going to be problems. There is problems there. So yeah, the NCSC did put together an initiative just in 2020 to supply trusts with a small amount of funding each to protect them against that. Osirium did a lot of work and still does around that. We brought on board a number of trusts as part of that initiative and basically, controlling the workflow for a limited amount of people to have access to backup. As I mentioned earlier, things like just-in-time approval. You might want those accounts that have access to the backup system to be approved when people get access. You might want those accounts on the backup system to be local to the backup system, not Active Directory, for instance. You might want to limit the amount of people that externally can access that to the organisation. Record it, multi-factor authentication on the front end again, and then you're controlling who has access to those systems, and you know exactly when they're on those systems and what they've done.
And it's fair to say, I think you already sort of alluded to this, that the backups are the best route to recovery in the event that an attack has taken place.
So, yeah, but it's also a very keen point for someone to attack.
Yeah.
Because of what it holds.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you for those responses, Graham. So we've also got one more poll we'd like to ask your views now, please. Going to just put this up on the screen, and we appreciate your feedback. Thank you.
It's gone live. So people are voting now. So we've got quite a strong response there. So,
thank you very much for your answer. We can see that for a number of people, nearly 70% say very important. So yeah, thank you for your responses on that. Now we've come to the point in the webinar where we'd like to open it up to yourselves to ask questions to Graham. We'll endeavour to answer those questions as best we can now. It may be that we speak to one of our team and come back to you afterwards, but please feel free on the questions panel here on the side and go to webinar.
I've got one coming in already. We've got plenty of time, I think, still. So someone's asking, can you give us an indication of typical costs? Typical is very difficult to. Depends. We're licensed per target system, so we're very cost effective in the NHS. If you'd like further conversations around cost, please do get in contact and we can jump on a call and have a nice conversation around that with you. There's no problem at all. Any other questions?
I think there's another question that's come in here about deployment. How quick is deployment? So I mean, I know we pride ourselves on getting things up and running much faster than a typical PAM solution. Graham, any more you can talk about the speed of deployment for PAM?
It's one of the reasons why I think NHS finds probably easy to deploy, easy to use, easy to administer, and quick time to ROI. That's what we invest in, very short on the amount of services used. You'll see that if you get a quote from us, we like you to get up and running quickly, and then be a happy, successful, referenceable customer of ours. But again, if you give us an indication of what your deployment looks like, that would give us a better indication of the typical time and cost to deploy it.
Well, I think that's the questions we have so far. But if you'd like to ask Graham or any of the rest of the team a question, we'd be very happy to get in touch to continue the conversation afterwards. A couple of things to mention. As referenced here on our slide, we have a privileged access management guide that you can download here from your side panel. We will be talking more about the NHS cyber strategy as that comes out, so look out for that. But in the meantime, thanks very much for attending today. We hope you found it useful, and just let's say goodbye.
Thank you very much for your time. Hope you get in touch.
Thank you.